Hi, everyone. It's Reverend Mark Abernethy back here at the foot of the cross. Welcome to all of you. This is Tuesday of Holy Week. You know, one of the questions people have been asking for generations is a question that's particularly prevalent this week, I think. People who are young and old have been asking this question for as long as anybody can remember, going all the way back to the day when Jesus actually died. And the question is, why? Why did Jesus die on the cross? I've been thinking about that question. It actually is related to a particular word in theology, one of those fancy theological words that you may or may not remember. I learned it back in seminary, and the word is called atonement. And there are various theories of atonement, atonement being the idea of why it is that Jesus died on the cross. So there are different theories that have been proposed down through the centuries, through the generations, and over time there were three historical or classical theories of atonement. The first theory of atonement says that Jesus died on the cross because it was a way in which Jesus' death on the cross was a way of paying ransom to the devil. I can't tell you a whole lot about that atonement theory because it tends to be a theory that you would hear more often in a conservative or a fundamentalist Christian church, and it's not a theory of atonement you would hear here at Wapping Community Church or in another UCC church. The second theory of atonement is the notion that Jesus died on the cross to take on the sin of the world. And the cross on which Jesus died is God's ultimate symbol of forgiveness, which doesn't mean that human beings should continue to sin freely. We all have ways in which we need to work to be less sinful in our lives. But the cross is the moment in time when Jesus took on all of our human sin and bore our human sin. And the time when you would hear me talk about this wording or this theory in theology would be during communion, where I talk about Jesus giving the bread and the cup as a way of forgiving our sins. The third classical theory of atonement is called the moral influence theory. So Jesus died on the cross to teach us something, to teach something to human beings. And human beings, like all of you and like me, are supposed to learn from Jesus' death on the cross how to better love one another. We don't always do a particularly good job at loving one another, but Jesus loved us so much that he was willing to give his life for us on the cross. And if Jesus loved us that much, then we in turn ought to learn and practice loving one another better. So those are the three simplified versions of atonement that have been proposed down through history. There is a fourth theory of atonement that I learned in seminary. It came into being in the 1970s, as I remember it, and it was proposed first, I think, in Latin America. People, especially in third world countries, read through the New Testament and the stories of Jesus. And what they noticed in Jesus was an option or a particular love Jesus had in his heart for people who were poor and people who were oppressed. So if you read through the stories in the Gospels, you can see Jesus reaching out to marginalized people, people who lived on the edge. You can see him time and again reaching out to those who needed healing because they were sick, to those who were grieving because they were lonely and sad. Jesus reaching out to people who were hungry, people who were disabled. Jesus time and time again reached out to people on the margins. And that theology was particularly helpful for people who lived in third world countries and were struggling to make ends meet. They saw in Jesus somebody who had a special affinity for people who were poor and oppressed in the world, and that affinity was something that connected with people. And so liberation theology was born in the 1970s. And the liberation theology of atonement says that Jesus died on the cross in solidarity with people who are being crucified, people who are suffering, people who are being people who are in need of healing. Jesus died in solidarity with people in our world who are being crucified each and every day. I think about that liberation theology of atonement, especially this year. I know that this pandemic time has had a really profound impact on many of us. It has been difficult for first responders, and it's been difficult for all of us who are forced to isolate. It's been difficult for healthcare workers and teachers and people who work in nursing homes and first responders and older people and people who are immune compromised, and hard on children who can't go to school, and college students who've been sent home. And there's all kinds of people for whom this pandemic has been a hardship. But as is the case so often, in my opinion, this particular crisis has been particularly difficult for our sisters and brothers who live on the edge, who are marginalized and poor and oppressed each and every day. I think about them especially this week. I think about people who have multiple jobs and work minimum wage jobs just to make ends meet. And if one of those jobs disappears because there's not enough business or because the place that they work has to close down, how is it that poor sisters and brothers make ends meet? I think about that with people who have no choice but to try and go into work each day regardless of the threat to their health, because they really have no choice. They have to make income to put food on their tables and to pay for their monthly bills. I think about people who may be starting to feel sick in our world but have no health insurance and have no way to go to the hospital or to get tested or to do the kind of things that so many of us are able to do. And I think about liberation theology, especially this week. Jesus died on the cross in solidarity with so many people in this country, people whose names we don't necessarily know, people whose stories we can't really tell because we don't know them, people who we so often don't even recognize because they're sort of invisible, they're nameless and faceless in our world. But I think Jesus died in solidarity, especially for those he holds in his heart, those who are poor, those who are oppressed, those who are suffering, those who are struggling, those working day and night to survive and to try and make ends meet, and indeed those who are dying by themselves, those who are dying alone, those who are dying because this crisis was the last straw on the camel's back, and now the camel has indeed broken. So I will be praying indeed for those sisters and brothers in our world, especially this week, thinking about how much privilege I have in the midst of this crisis, and thinking about ways in which I can reach out and offer the love of Jesus in solidarity with the ones Jesus called the least of his brothers and sisters, so that the hope offered to all of God's people when Easter comes is hope that can truly be experienced by each and every one of God's children, from the richest among us all the way to the poorest, from those who struggle all the way to those who are making their way through this particular pandemic without much struggle at all. In that spirit, I wish all of you a continued blessed Holy Week.